Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Hey, we want to give a big shout out. We hit 100 subscribers last week. Thank you, everybody. We're very happy about that. Now we just need you to get us to 1,000. So if you could start working on that, that would be great.
Yeah, right.
So click on that subscribe button if you haven't done so. And we'd also like you to click the like button and the bell icon as well. We appreciate y'all.
That's right. Thank you guys so much for pushing us over that little first hump. We do appreciate it. So each week, for those of you who are new to the channel, each week Todd and I we have a conversation about the upcoming weekend's lectionary reading from the Gospels. And our goal is to talk about those readings in the context of love and societal justice and inclusion. Our hope is that our talking will be just, as in justice, but that also we might say something during this conversation that would inspire you alongside with us to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what are we looking at this week? What's our passage?
We are in Mark, which we will be for quite a bit. We're just moving forward from last week. We're in Mark 1, verses 21 to 28.
Yeah. So last week, Jesus called his first disciples, and this week's story is Mark's inaugural act of Jesus, and it takes place on the Sabbath in a synagogue, and it's none other than an exorcism. And so that, even before we try to give a modern application to that, that produces all kinds of problems.
Hmm.
I don't know if exorcism is
Yeah.
triggering to you.
Yeah. I mean, it is, yeah, just, there's, it's one of those things that I grew up being taught a lot about, being told Christian ghost stories about demons and demons being cast out and things like that, and missionary stories about demons and stuff like that. So, growing up as a
Yeah, it triggers me
believer
just hearing
in,
you say that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, those were that's the whole. I think probably in the whole conversation and teaching and of on the supernatural stuff, um, this was the most compelling, the most fascinating, but also just the most scary.
It was horrific,
Is
like literally.
encountering the possibility of encountering stuff like this. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was 9 years old, I remember I was scrolling through the TV channels late one night, and it was late night. And I don't know why I was watching television by myself as a 9 year old late at night. But of all the things that I could have landed on, it was the 1970s, and I don't know what year this movie came out, but it was the Exorcist, the original one. And
Hmm.
man, this scarred me for life. Like I will still see in my mind's eye her face when I'm outside at night when it's dark. And I'm not typically a person who's afraid of the dark. But anytime that enters into my brain while I am outside or in a dark place in my house
Hmm.
without the lights, I just freak out. I have to take a moment, recompose. It left
Yeah.
me. I mean, it had a and not just that. I mean, the exorcism stories are bad enough in the sense of how much trauma they cause people in a religious context. But I was also having
Hmm.
a conversation this week with a couple of my gay friends who had gone to um,
Uh,
various and sundry make them straight ministry camps and
hmm.
different, whatever those
Hmm.
are, the old, you know, whether it was Exodus or whatever those ministries were
Yeah.
that tried to make gay people straight. And many times what they would assume or what they
Mm-hmm.
would claim or accuse. That's the word I was looking for. What they would accuse my gay friends of being is demon possessed.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then they would have I mean, they would literally get around and try to exorcise the homosexual demon out of these people. And
Mm-hmm.
what a traumatic experience for what you are, who you are,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be labeled as demonic, as a demon
Demonic.
inside of you, and then to go through the trauma of them trying to cast that out of you. And
Mm.
we all know now, none of that stuff works. None of that stuff is
Right.
true. None of that stuff
Yep.
actually turned anybody straight. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's just ill-informed and very harmful. But I mean that's traumatizing, and that's a triggering part of this story too. But it's in the Jesus story, and it's definitely in the lectionary readings this week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we need a better way of reading this passage, and putting it in a good context, which I think you do with what you put together this week, Herb.
Well, my approach is a little different. The traditional approach is the typical approach is to, in modern scholarship, to try to demythologize these stories and say, well, these were really stories not of literal demon possession, but of mental illness or epilepsy, or they try to
Mm-hmm.
give some scientific basis for it. And I understand the reason for that as far as trying to heal the trauma from the way these stories have been used. But I take a little bit different tact in the sense that I think these communities in which these stories were circling, these were oppressed communities that were speaking to each other truths to remind each other and to work towards liberation together. They were speaking true values and truths of liberation to one another in a coded language in such a way as to stay under the radar of the Roman Empire or the powers that be. You know, they were communicating truths to
Mm-hmm.
each other. Where today we look at this and say, possession and exorcism. Well, what is this really
Mm-hmm.
about? So I have a little different spin on it from looking at it from what, how would have an oppressed community, a community on the margins of the Roman Empire, how would they have possibly used these stories? Because they're definitely part of it. And then what keys me in? There's multiple things that hint to me of that. And the first thing, and maybe we can talk about this for a minute, there were lots of healers, there were lots of exorcists in Jesus's
Mm-hmm.
society and in that day and age.
Yeah.
None of them get the kind of pushback that Jesus does immediately. In
Mm-hmm.
other words, they were looked at, they were tolerated, they was live and let live, they were left alone, they were doing their thing. But there's something unique about Jesus's exorcism that caused the authorities to come down on him right from the start.
Right.
So that
Yeah. I think that's the and again and that's and that reality is what Mark is trying to bring to the forefront right away. And that I think what you're talking about is important because uh, he's not just trying to tell a story about somebody being cast out, having a demon cast out. The purpose of the story is not just there's a man who had a demon and Jesus cast it out and the man was better. The end. There
right.
is there's
If
so
that
much
had been
more
the story, there
that
would have
he
been
is
no negative response.
right. I mean, people have said, "Hey, that's great," for whatever it's worth. I mean, but yeah, there is this is this is Mark setting up what Jesus is about. He's picking up from Jesus declaring the kingdom of God is at hand. This is Jesus is doing more than simply casting out a demon.
Right. Right. And again, we get hints of that. I mean, in Mark 3, the immediate response of the Pharisees to Jesus's exorcisms is they want to go out. They immediately set out about start plotting how to kill him. And in
Mm,
Mark 3 further on down, towards the end of Mark 3, they're accusing him of casting out demons by the prince of demons, Beelzebul. You know what I mean? They
mm-hmm,
didn't do that. There wasn't this
Yeah.
immediate negative pushback. So the hints in the story are, if we look at it narratively and then literarily, it's happening on the Sabbath and it's happening in the synagogue. And the first thing it tells us is that Jesus's ministry is different because it has its own authority, unlike the scribal establishment. And what I want to make sure we don't do is somehow think that this was a critique against Sabbath or synagogue. This is not an anti
Mm-hmm.
Semitic parable at all. But as
Mm-hmm.
you progress
Mm-hmm.
through the Gospel of Mark, we see over and over again that these are not, as you said, individual stories of individual deliverances. These are metaphors for the systemic
Mm-hmm.
oppression of his people who were possessed and indwelt by the Roman Empire. It's not anti
Mm-hmm.
Sabbath, it's not anti synagogue. It's that the scribal establishment is only functioning under the leave or permission of the Roman Empire, and they're under that authority. That authority is working through them. They're being complicit in that, cooperating with that. And Jesus steps into the synagogue on the Sabbath, encounters the scribal establishment, and Mark says, let's tell a story about
Mm-hmm.
casting out the demon. And we know this because when we get to Mark 5, the demon comes right out and says their name is Legion, which was,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you said the word Legion back in that day and age, that is an immediate association with the Roman Empire because that was the largest Roman
Mm-hmm.
military unit. And they were the ones that possessed or had a standing presence in their territory, especially in areas where uprisings could spring forth at any moment that would threaten the Pax Romana.
Mm-hmm.
Basically he's saying our society, our culture, our systems, we need to get back to the teachings of the Torah. Again, Jesus it was a Jewish renewal movement. We need to get back to the
Mm-hmm.
justice teachings of the Torah because of the harm being done to people. And the first preparatory work is to cast out the the presence, the indwelling of the Roman Empire. And when you put on that lens to this story, there's so much more that starts jumping out at you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is this is so important. It actually aligns with other scriptures in the New Testament that use code language for Rome as well. That this fits perfectly with what any all the writings, and I'm thinking specifically of Revelation at this point, the writings that were the code language to say really treasonous, treacherous things about the Roman Empire without naming them,
Right.
and to but leaving no doubt to anybody with any intelligence who was reading it that they knew who the writer was writing about. And
Right.
so
That's
when
that language of the oppressed community when they talk to each other in such a way
yeah,
as to not
that's
get
right.
in trouble and still communicate truth.
It's like the Negro spirituals being the code language for telling people how to flee to the North during times
Exactly.
of slavery. It's that type of stuff that only like you said the oppressed people group would understand and could interpret so they knew what was being said. And I
And
think
even if
this
the master had understood it, there was always the double meaning in it. So someone could,
deniability,
yeah,
yeah,
the deniability where you could say, oh, no, that's not what we meant. As I hit my
right,
microphone, that's not what we meant. We're talking about Jesus. You know what I'm saying?
right. So I think this is again, it lines up. It aligns with the way that that other scriptures talk about Rome, and it also aligns with Jesus having a political purpose to what he's doing, and not partisan politics work, but a political in the sense of challenging the structures and the
Mm.
corruption of those structures. And again, not targeting people groups, ethnicities, religions, but targeting corruption within human systems, and specifically in this context, the Roman corruption of Jewish religion, which maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, about how we see that in the priestly class and the scribal class and the
Yeah, I
even
mean, the
even
high priest were selected by Caesar. The high priest was chosen by Rome every year. It wasn't
mm,
an election. It was they were Rome's agent, and they answered to Herod and Caesar both. Herod was Caesar's agent. You know what I mean? And so
mhm,
what Jesus is saying here, he's not anti-temple, he's not anti-Sabbath, he's not anti-synagogue. He's anti the way those things have been co-opted by the Roman Empire and used to do imperial damage to the most vulnerable in his society.
mhm.
It's a
And
class
so
thing. It was the elites, the powerful.
yeah, yeah, and I think and this. Well, I mean, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I was
No,
going
no,
to
go
start the
ahead.
application. Well, no. We'll get to application. Keep going. I'm jumping ahead of my mind. But go ahead.
So, a little bit of affirmation of this lens, interpretive lens that we're using. Whenever we need to pay attention to the first stories of any gospel, like in Luke, the first story that characterizes Jesus' the rest of his ministry in the Gospel of Luke is Luke 4:18 through 19, where Jesus is liberator of the oppressed. Here in Mark,
Mm-hmm.
the very first inaugural action of Jesus after calling his disciples is this exorcism on the Sabbath, sacred time, and in the synagogue, sacred space. All those things that are sacred have been co-opted by the Roman Empire, and it's fascinating. I share all of these references in my blog this week at renewedheartministries.com. Shameless plug, but in Joshua 22:24, Judges 11:12, 1 Kings 17:18, and 1 Kings 4 through 9, the language that the possessed person that immediately confronts Jesus when he shows up in this synagogue, not under Rome's authority, but in his own authority, that language is used. The language that's used in the mouth of the demoniac is this phrase, what have you to do with us? Did you come here to destroy us? Did you come here to torment us? We know you're the Holy One. All of that language in those verses that I just referenced, these are almost quotations from when prophets, just as Hebrew prophets, used to stand up to unjust powers, like when Elijah would stand up to Jezebel, or
Mm-hmm.
what have you to do with me? Have you come here to destroy? Who do you think
Mm-hmm.
you are? You know what I'm saying? And the title of the Holy One, that's what those powers that be in these examples also referred to to these prophets as. So again, from a Christian perspective, we look at that Holy One language that the demon uses towards Jesus, and we say, oh, see, that's proof that Jesus was divine, the Son of God. But to a
Mm-hmm.
Jewish audience, what they would have, who was used to hearing these other Hebrew passages read Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath in the synagogue, they would have seen the same style of rhetoric, the same style of language being
Mm-hmm.
now aimed at Jesus from this demon that the powers that be used to also use against the Hebrew prophets. And the parallel there would have been unmistakable. This is another moment where we're speaking truth to power and casting
Mm-hmm.
out unjust structures, not individualistic, not individual deliverance. We're purifying systems. We're casting out the
Mm-hmm.
injustice that is systemic.
Mm. Yeah, I think this again is important to see in the context of um, how people of the time understand Jesus, and I think you have to recognize there is an evolution process taking place, how people saw Jesus, and you look especially in the synoptic gospels, which are written earlier, Jesus is seen much more in the prophetic
Absolutely.
role and and being a messenger of God more than he was of being seen as a divine figure, having supernatural qualities about him.
Right.
Um,
That's the Gospel of John.
John is very much over on the supernatural side, and Paul and his writings are
Right.
moving that, and Revelation and all those have definitely moved to Jesus and as a divine figure. But these earlier writings show where the people were, where the writers were. Um, they were still grappling with understanding who Jesus was, and what they saw was a very important human figure in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets, in the tradition of speaking against foreign oppression, evil oppression, economic oppression, um,
Yeah.
and
And I want to
and
push
the
back a
power
little bit
structures.
because this is definitely true. I think I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want all the scholars that are listening to us tonight to throw me off a cliff. the
Yeah,
the
that's a joke, folks. By the way, that was a joke.
the is a bad joke. So the the Gospels were the recordings of things that are much older oral traditions about Jesus.
Right.
But between those oral traditions and the writing down of those oral traditions, you have the writings of Paul happening before Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written down,
That's
right?
true. That's true. Right.
And Paul, and this is amazing to me, Paul takes a very high Christology in his writings.
Hmm.
And so, if it was just a matter of evolution, eventually they're going to get to where Paul was, and everybody's going to be like John, and
Hmm.
that's the
Hmm.
goal. Then Matthew,
Hmm.
Mark, and Luke, when they were written down, they should have also had a high Christology.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
instead of them not following Paul's example, like John,
Hmm.
and choosing what
Hmm.
you just said, that prophetic emphasis rather than the divine Son of God
Hmm.
emphasis, except for when contrasted with Caesar. But instead of that divine emphasis, choosing the prophetic emphasis, what this
Hmm.
reveals to
Hmm.
us is the plurality that
Yeah.
existed in the early church. And that's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so different from John. There was a community
Hmm.
that said, listen, there is much more power in seeing Jesus prophetically standing against
Hmm.
injustice for
Hmm.
the oppressed and marginalized. And that's where you and I
Hmm.
resonate, Todd. Then there
Hmm.
is in viewing Jesus cosmically and focused on just the afterlife, which was
Hmm.
where Paul
Hmm.
and John and all that other portion
Hmm.
of early Christianity was.
Yeah. Good point.
So
I
that tension
appreciate
is
that
there from the very
clarification.
beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
definitely
That's good.
Paul is or John is late, but the fact that Paul is so early gives me it just gives
You're
me
right.
some affirmation
Hmm.
that even with all that later high Christology, they
Hmm.
had that option when they wrote Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they rejected it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's a little jarring. That makes you start to ask questions.
Hmm. 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 And 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 again, along with that, uh, the high Christology, the shift from uh, confronting existing worldly powers in the here and now to shifting to a individualistic escaping earth type of salvific experience that Paul and John uh, seem to focus on. Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very much about what is happening in their present, both in the present of when Jesus was alive and then applying it to the present of when they write their gospels.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah,
so
in both
I
cases, you have that diversity of opinion existing and conflicting with each other.
that's right. That's right. And again, I reject this idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were just immature versions of the Jesus story that hadn't evolved into full revelation yet. You know, and
Hmm. Hmm.
there was some intentionality there in how they chose. They had options, and there was some
Hmm.
intentionality in how they chose to represent Jesus. And I'm thankful for the way they did it. That's the Jesus, the version of Jesus that resonates with me.
Right. Absolutely.
But now we just got on the nature of scripture and all that stuff, which that wasn't supposed to be tonight's
That
topic.
was my fault. That was my fault because I spoke inaccurately.
No, no,
My
it's all
bad.
good. No, no, it's true. I mean, the Gospels, the oral tradition of the Gospels is the earliest. They just chose not to change
Hmm.
it.
Hmm. Yep.
So here's where it comes down to it for me and how we understand the exorcisms, if we understand them politically or supernaturally. First of all, exorcisms were a common belief, that worldview, that was common when the Gospels were written. You've got the apocalyptic worldview, where they believed there was a seen world and an unseen world with good forces and bad forces. And the bad forces had their agents in the material world, and the good forces had their agents in the material world. And all the conflict and injustice we see in the material world is just because behind the scenes, the spiritual world, the unseen world, the powers that be, they're in conflict. And so exorcism in that context makes perfect sense in their, for them and what they're trying to communicate. What they're saying is if Jesus is casting out demons and it's somehow associated to Rome, then Rome is the conduit in the material world of the devils and the demons and everything that opposes God's just world and God's justice work. But they get to the end of Mark chapter 1, and we're going to get there in the lectionary too. But if we just jump just ahead, it says the way Mark chapter 1 ends, so he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues. And it doesn't say and healing all who are sick, like Matthew does, or those others. The one event that after all the things that Jesus did, the one thing that it chooses to name is preaching in their synagogues and driving out the demons. So
Hmm.
driving out the demons is associated with what Jesus is doing within that sacred space of the synagogue. And then in Mark 3 and Mark 6, it says he appointed the 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And then Mark 6, calling the 12 to him, the 12 to him, he began to send them out two by two and gave them authority over impure spirits. So again, out of all the things that could be named that Jesus is doing and empowering his disciples and followers to do, this is the thing he names, is this exorcism stuff, and we gloss over it
Hmm.
because of our scientific worldview that we don't have tolerance for today. And I get that, the way it's been abused and the horrific trauma that it's caused when taken literally, which I don't think we should. Well, I get that, but the reality is, in the story, this is a central part of Mark's gospel because Mark's is probably the most political gospel, and he's commissioning his followers to do the same. So, what does, in our scientific worldview, what does casting out demons look like for Jesus followers now? What does that look like? And I want to say it definitely is not trying to convert gay people to being straight.
Hmm.
That's horrific.
Yeah.
So, what does it look like? What are some modern day applications?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is calling out corruption in our churches,
Mm-hmm.
calling out how our churches have been co-opted by nationalistic teaching or co-opted by a certain political party. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's certainly one that would seem to parallel the casting out of the demon in the synagogue.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, religious communities, I think, should be about justice. They should be about
Hmm.
compassion. We should care about issues when there are things being done that harm the vulnerable. But whenever a religious movement, I'm thinking about large swaths, certainly not all, I know there are exceptions to this, but large swaths of the evangelical world, how they have been possessed by one single political party
Mm,
where they have just this unconditional fidelity or this unconditional loyalty to not just that party, but one specific person in that party that could
mm,
not be further from in his actions, could not be
mhm,
further from the image, the ethics, the values that we of Jesus that we encounter in the Jesus story. So
mm,
anti, and yet there are, again, I know there are exceptions, but the largest conglomerate of supporters right now for that person is the
mm,
evangelical Christian world.
mm.
That's something that needs
Yeah,
exercised.
absolutely. Absolutely. There was something just to give equal time. Um, I was watching, and you'll forgive me for not having the reference of the congregation of the pastor who did this, but as is traditional on Martin Luther King Day, and certainly with presidents of who are Democrats, they will often come to a prominent black congregation and preach about the legacy of Dr. King or speak about the legacy of Dr. King as part of a celebration about Dr. King's life, which on the surface, it seems like a good thing to do. Um, but this black pastor, he courageously, I thought, uh, stood up the next Sunday in his pulpit and condemned the co-opting of an oppressed of a historically uh, oppressed people, a congregation of historically oppressed people, to speak about the legacy of Dr. King and that we need to follow the legacy of Dr. King, while at the same time is supporting the genocidal violence of Israel against Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's not unconditional loyalty to a political party. It's about standing up to injustice regardless of where it's happening.
Yeah. And so this pastor had the courage to speak up and say the president that he probably voted for uh, was behaving antithetically to the teachings of Dr. King and should not be co-opting his legacy and hiding his
Yeah,
support of
right.
violence
Right.
against a people group.
What a
And
contradiction.
and I think that, and so I think that's one way of another way of recognizing we can't casting out demons is casting out
All
the
injustice.
influence of out casting out all injustice and casting out the influence of uh, political agendas that seek to put party over people.
That's right. Regardless of which party it is. And
That's
I'm
right.
not saying all things are equal. I'm not doing that's a false equivalency. I understand that. But neither party is immune to pushing their own political agenda when it comes to justice
Right.
matters at times.
Yeah.
but
I mean, you
to
you do what you can, and you work with flawed humans the best you can, and align with the best options that are out there. But you have to remain very clear and keep yourself free from falling under the spell and the power of political entities.
I will say that here locally in Appalachia, when certain politicians are in power, and typically when certain parties have the majority, there are presences in our local governments, I'm talking about statewide, that are
Mm-hmm.
more open. I have found in my own experience, they're more open to the justice changes that I want to see made in society than the other
Mm-hmm.
party. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But again,
For
neither
sure.
party is perfect, and we need to have the boldness to call out either party when they're committing injustice.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Let me open up one more can of worms since we're talking about politics. I didn't write about this in my blog. I saved it just for you, Todd, just for our moment together.
I'm so happy.
Having an American flag in the sanctuary, is that a
Mm,
kind of possession,
mm,
or where empire is dwelling in a sacred space?
wow.
What you know what I mean? Like, I know the Mennonite
Yeah.
position, I know the Anabaptist position towards that. But
Right.
I'm not asking you to answer this, Todd, but I am asking our watchers tonight to at least chew on it. Just think about it.
I'll
Is
just tell
that
you
is
that. I'll tell you that after January 6th, uh, well, I'll tell. Let me back up. When I was still a pastor of congregation, um, I removed the American and Christian flags from the sanctuary, and it went unnoticed for a period of time, and then it became noticed. And I'll tell you how important it was for some people is that there were people who threatened to leave the congregation if the American flag, and they were only concerned about the American flag. They weren't even that concerned about the Christian flag. I have problems with both flags, but it was telling to me that they were only really concerned about the American flag, and that was back in the sanctuary. And so I can tell you that there were people who very much believed in this God and country marriage,
but that's
and all the
exactly what we're
God
talking
bless
about.
America. We're talking. I mean, it's exactly that. And so I gave in and said, all right, that's maybe this isn't the hill I'm going to die on. So I brought the flags back. Um, but then after January 6th and seeing all those Christian and American flags waving outside the Capitol as they tried to take down our government, I took them out of the sanctuary again, and they stayed out.
It's
But
empire
that's it.
leaving their banner in both, once again, to quote our story, sacred space and sacred time, making sure their presence is seen.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a lot to chew on. Well, we just dropped in viewership this week, Todd.
yeah. Let's see. Let's keep seeing who else can we offend because we've got so many viewers to spare.
Oh, for those of you who are watching us each week, I want to thank you so much for your support and for seeing value in this conversation that we have each week to just give your time to it, even if it's just curiosity to see what we're saying this week. I just appreciate each one of our viewers so much. And I hope that we didn't lose viewers tonight over this. They are serious themes that I think deserve serious contemplation. And it's too easy to take the exorcism stories literally and to inflict people with religious trauma as a result of that. What is the political lesson that the author of Mark is wanting us to see in these stories?
Hmm. All right. Anything else you want to tell us, Herb, about
That's what I
Renewed
got
Our
this week,
Ministries?
man.
Anything? All
If
right.
you're using the lectionary this weekend, best of luck to you.
Yeah.
It's a thorny one.
This is the challenge when you start really digging into these gospel readings is what you this is let me say from personal experience that preaching this stuff doesn't necessarily grow your congregation. So, you know, be careful we know you have to balance some really tough issues out there and trying to minister to people where they're at and wanting to be faithful to the scriptures. And for those of you who are trying to navigate that and be faithful, uh, you know, our hearts are with you because we really appreciate your conscientious efforts to
That's right.
speak to the people.
Well
So
said. Well said, Todd. All
y'all
right.
take care. Have a great week, and we'll catch up with you next week.
See you next week, everyone.